Hi Booktube, it's Amy. I'm here with Familiar Studies of Men and Books by Robert Louis Stevenson, and today I'm going to be reading to you the essay on Victor Hugo's romances. Now, I've never really been a fan of the works of Victor Hugo. I've taken a try at a couple of his books, but that doesn't mean I won't enjoy and haven't enjoyed reading the essay in here. And before I get started, I've got a beer with me here. This is another beer from Three Brewers, which is a pub and craft beer creator here in Ottawa. I think they've got 4 locations on the side of the can here. They've got their locations listed and the addresses, and they're all they're all they're all in Ontario. They've got a location in Toronto. There's one in Canada, which is pretty much part of Ottawa here. There is an Ottawa Central location on Spark Street, and then they have a location in Oakville, Ontario as well. And this is one of the white beers that I ordered, and I took a sip just a moment ago, and I quite like it. It's obviously a lighter beer, but it's not a weak beer, if that makes sense. It's still quite deep and flavorful despite being very light in color. So we'll set the beer aside and we'll pick up the book. And this little volume has this very delicate ribbon bookmark, and I'm so afraid it's just going to completely fray and come apart. You can sort of see here that it's half broken off already, so we'll just gently put that over the side of the book and begin here with Victor Hugo's romances. And I will skip the opening paragraph here because it is in the original French, and I will not subject you to my poor knowledge of French. Victor Hugo's romances occupy an important position in the history of literature. Many innovations, timidly made elsewhere, have in them been carried boldly out to their last consequences. Much that was indefinite in literary tendencies has attained to definite maturity. Many things have come to a point and have been distinguished one from the other. And it is only in the last romance of all, 93, that this culmination is most perfect. This is in the nature of things. Men who are in any way typical of a stage of progress may be compared more justly to the hand upon the dial of the clock, which continues to advance as it indicates, than to the stationary milestone, which is only the measure of what is past. The movement is not arrested. That significant something by which the work of such a man differs from that of his predecessors goes on, disengaging itself and becoming more and more articulate and cognizable. The same principle of growth that carried his first book beyond the books of previous writers carries his last book beyond his first. And just as the most imbecile production of any literary age gives us something, sometimes, the very clue to the comprehension we have sought long and vainly in contemporary masterpieces, so it may be the very weakest of an author's books that, coming in the sequel of many others, enables us at last to get hold of what underlies the whole of them, of that spinal marrow of significance that unites the works of his life into something organic and rational. This is what has been done by 93 for the earlier romances of Victor Hugo, and through them for a whole division of modern literature. We have here the legitimate continuation of a long and living literary tradition, and hence, so far, its explanation. When many lines diverge from each other in direction, so slightly as to confuse the eye, we know that we have only to produce them to make the chaos plain. This is continually so in literary history, and we shall best understand the importance of Victor Hugo's romances if we think of them as some such prolongation of one of the many lines of literary tendency. When we compare the novels of Walter Scott with those of the men of genius who preceded him, and whom he delighted to honor as a master in the art, I mean Henry Fielding, we shall be somewhat puzzled at the moment to state the difference that there is between these two. Fielding has as much human science, has a far firmer hold upon the tiller of his story, has a keen sense of character which he draws, and Scott often does so too, in a rather abstract and academical manner, and finally is quite as humorous and quite as good-humored as the great Scotchman. With all these points of resemblance between the men, it is astonishing that their work should be so different. The fact is that the English novel was looking one way and seeking one set of effects in the hands of Fielding, and in the hands of Scott it was looking eagerly in all ways and searching for all the effects that by any possibility it could utilize. The difference between these two men marks a great enfranchisement. With Scott, the romantic movement, the movement of an extended curiosity and an enfranchised imagination has begun. This is a trite thing to say, but trite things are often very indefinitely comprehended. And this enfranchisement is, as far as it regards the technical change that came over modern prose romance, has never perhaps been explained with any clearness. To do so, it will be necessary roughly to compare the two sets of conventions upon which plays and romances are respectively based. The purposes of these two arts are so much alike, and they deal so much with the same passions and interests, that we are apt to forget the fundamental opposition of their methods. And yet such a fundamental opposition exists. In the drama, the action is developed in great measure by means of things that remained outside of the art, by means of real things, that is, and not artistic conventions for things. This is a sort of realism that is not to be confounded with that realism in painting of which we hear so much. The realism in painting is a thing of purposes. This that we have to indicate in the drama is an affair of method. We have heard a story indeed of a painter in France who, when he wanted to paint a sea beach, carried realism from his ends to his means and plastered real sand upon his canvas. And that is precisely what is done in drama. The dramatic author has to paint his beaches with real sand. Real live men and women move about the stage. We hear real voices. What is feigned merely puts a sense upon what is. We do actually see a woman go behind a screen as Lady Teazle, and after a certain interval we do actually see her very shamefully produced again. Now all these things that remain as they were in life and are not transmuted into any artistic convention are terribly stubborn and difficult to deal with, and hence there are for the dramatist many resultant limitations in time and space. These limitations in some sort approximate towards those of painting. The dramatic author is tied down, not indeed to a moment, but to the duration of each scene or act. He is confined to the stage, almost as the painter is confined within his frame. But the great restriction is this, that a dramatic author must deal with his actors, and with his actors alone. Certain moments of suspense, certain significant dispositions of personages, a certain logical growth of emotion, these are the only means at the disposal of the playwright. It is true that, with the assistance of the scene painter, the costumer, and the conductor of the orchestra, he may add to this something of a pageant, something of sound and fury, but these are, for the dramatic writer, beside the mark, and do not come under the vivifying touch of his genius. When we turn to romance, we find this no longer. Here, nothing is reproduced to our senses directly, not only the main conception of the work, but the scenery, the appliances, the mechanism by which this conception is brought home to us, have been put through the crucible of another man's mind, and come out again, one and all, in the form of written words. With the loss of every degree of such realism as we have described, there is for art a clear gain of liberty and largeness of competence. Thus, painting in which the round outlines of things are thrown onto a flat board is far more free than sculpture, in which their solidity is preserved, or solidity rather, in which their solidity is preserved. It is by giving up these identities that art gains true strength. And so in the case of novels as compared to the stage. Continuous narration is the flat board onto which the novelist throws everything, and from this there results for him a great loss of vividness, but a great compensating gain in his power over the subject, so that he can now subordinate one thing to another in importance, and introduce all manner of very subtle detail to a degree that was before impossible. He can render just as easily the flourish of trumpets before a victorious emperor, and the gossip of country market women, the gradual decay of 40 years of a man's life, and the gesture of a passionate moment. He finds himself equally unable if he looks at it from one point of view, equally able if he looks at it from another point of view, to reproduce a color, a sound, an outline, a logical argument, a physical action. He can show his readers behind and around the personages that for the moment occupy the foreground of his story, the continual suggestion of the landscape, the turn of the weather that will turn with it men's lives and fortunes, dimly foreshadowed on the horizon, the fatality of distant events, the stream of national tendency, the salient framework of causation. And all this thrown upon the flat board, all this entering naturally and smoothly into the texture of continuous intelligent narration. This touches the difference between Fielding and Scott. In the work of the latter, true to his character of a modern and a romantic, we become suddenly conscious of the background. Fielding, on the other hand, although he had recognized that the novel was nothing else than an epic in prose, wrote in the spirit not of the epic, but of the drama. This is not, of course, to say that the drama was in any way incapable of a regeneration similar in kind to that of which I am now speaking with regard to the novel. The notorious contrary fact is sufficient to guard the reader against such a misconstruction. All that is meant is that Fielding remained ignorant of certain capabilities which the novel possesses over the drama, or at least neglected and did not develop them. To the end, he continued to see things as a playwright sees them. The world with which he dealt, the world which he had realized for himself and sought to realize set before his readers, was a world of exclusively human interest. As for landscape, he was content to underline stage directions, as it might be done in a playbook. Tom and Molly retire into a practicable wood. As for nationality and public sentiment, it is curious enough to think that Tom Jones is laid in the year 45, and that the only use he makes of the rebellion is to throw a troop of soldiers into his hero's way. It is most really important, however, to remark the change which has been introduced into the conception of characters by the beginning of the Romantic movement and the consequent introduction into fiction of a vast amount of new material. Fielding tells us as much as he thought necessary to account for the actions of his creatures. He thought that each of these actions could be decomposed on the spot into a few simple personal elements, as we decompose a force in a question of abstract dynamics. The larger motives are all unknown to him, and he had not understood that the nature of the landscape or the spirit of the times could be anything in a story, and so, naturally and rightly, he said nothing about them. But Scott's instinct, the instinct of the man of an age profoundly different, taught him otherwise, and in his work the individual characters begin to occupy a comparatively small proportion of the canvas, on which armies maneuver and great hills pile themselves upon each other's shoulders. Fielding's characters were always great to the full stature of a perfectly arbitrary will. Already in Scott we begin to have a sense of the subtle influences that moderate and qualify a man's personality. That personality is no longer thrown out in unnatural isolation, but is resumed into its place in the constitution of things. And we are at a good spot for me to have another sip or two of beer here. And back down it goes. And so far, not a lot about Hugo here, mostly about Scott and Fielding. And we continue. It is this change in the manner of regarding men and their actions first exhibited in romance that has since renewed and vivified history. For art precedes philosophy and even science. People must have noticed things and interested themselves in them before they begin to debate upon their causes or influence. And it is in this way that art is the pioneer of knowledge. Those predilections of the artist he knows not why, those irrational acceptions and recognitions reclaim, out of the world that we have not yet realized, ever another and another corner. And after the facts have been thus vividly brought before us, and have had time to settle and arrange themselves in our minds, some day there will be found the man of science to stand up and give the explanation. Scott took an interest in many things in which Fielding took none, and for this reason and no other, he introduced them into his romances. If he had been told what would be the nature of the movement that he was so lightly initiating, he would have been very incredulous and not a little scandalized. At the time when he wrote, the real drift of this new manner of pleasing people in fiction was not yet apparent, and even now it is only by looking at the romances of Victor Hugo that we are enabled to form any proper judgment in the matter. These books are not only descended by ordinary generation from the Waverley novels, but it is in them chiefly that we shall find the revolutionary tradition of Scott carried farther. That we find Scott himself, and so far as regards his conception of prose fiction and its purposes, surpassed in his own spirit instead of tamely followed. We have here, as I said before, a line of literary tendency produced, and by this production definitely separated from others. When we come to Hugo, we see that the deviation which seems slight enough and not very serious between Scott and Fielding is indeed such a great gulf in thought and sentiment as only successive generations can pass over. And it is but natural that one of the chief advances that Hugo has made upon Scott is an advance in self-consciousness. Both men follow the same road, but where the one went blindly and carelessly, the other advances with all deliberation and forethought. There never was artist much more unconscious than Scott, and there have been not many more conscious than Hugo. The passage at the head of these pages shows how organically he had understood the nature of his own changes. He has underlying each of the 5 great romances, which alone I purpose here to examine, 2 deliberate designs, one artistic, and the other consciously ethical and intellectual. This is a man living in a different world from Scott, who professes sturdily in one of his introductions that he does not believe in novels having any moral influence at all, but still Hugo is too much of an artist to let himself be hampered by his dogmas. And the truth is that the artistic result seems, in at least one great instance, to have very little connection with the other or directly ethical result. The artistic result of a romance, what is left upon the memory by any really powerful and artistic novel, is something so complicated and refined that it is difficult to put a name upon it, and yet something as simple as nature. These 2 propositions may seem mutually destructive, but they are only so in appearance. The fact is that art is working far ahead of language as well as of science, realizing for us by all manner of suggestion and exaggerations effects for which as yet we have no direct name, nay, for which we may never perhaps have a direct name, for the reason that these effects do not enter very largely into the necessities of life. Hence alone is that suspicion of vagueness that often hangs about the purpose of a romance. It is clear enough to us in thought, but we are not used to consider anything clear until we are able to formulate it in words, and analytical language has not been sufficiently shaped to that end. We all know this difficulty in the case of a picture simple and strong, as may be the impression that it has left with us, and it is only because language is the medium of romance that we are prevented from seeing that the 2 cases are not the same. It is not that there is anything blurred or indefinite in the impression left with us. It is just because the impression is so very definite after its own kind that we find it hard to fit it exactly with the expressions of our philosophical speech. It is this idea which underlies and issues from a romance, this something which it is the function of that form of art to create, this epical value that I propose chiefly to seek, and as far as may be, to throw into relief in the present study. It is thus, I believe, that we shall see most clearly the great stride that Hugo has taken beyond his predecessors, and how, no longer content with expressing more or less abstract relations of man to man, he has set before himself the task of realizing, in the language of romance, much of the involution of our complicated lives. This epical value is not to be found, yet found, let it be understood, in every so-called novel. The great majority are not works of art in anything but a very secondary signification. One might almost number on one's fingers the works in which such a supreme artistic intention has been in any way superior to the other and lesser aims, themselves more or less artistic, that generally go hand in hand with it in the conception of prose romance. The purely critical spirit is in most novels paramount, At the present moment, we can recall only one man only, for whose works it would have been equally possible to accomplish our present design, and that man is Hawthorne. There is a unity, an unwavering creative purpose about some at least of Hawthorne's romances that impresses itself on the most indifferent reader, and the very restrictions and weaknesses of the man serve perhaps to strengthen the vivid and single impression of his works. There is nothing of this kind in Hugo. Unity, if he attains to it, is indeed unity out of multitude, and it is the wonderful power of subordination and synthesis thus displayed that gives us the measure of his talent. No amount of mere discussion and statement, such as this, could give a just conception of the greatness of this power. It must be felt in the books themselves, and all that can be done in the present essay is to recall to the reader the more general features of each of the 5 great romances, hurriedly and imperfectly as space will permit, and rather as a suggestion than anything more complete. The moral end that the author had before him in the conception of Notre Dame de Paris was, he tells us, to denounce the external fatality that hangs over men in the form of foolish and inflexible superstitions. To speak plainly, this moral purpose seems to have mighty little to do with the artistic conception. Moreover, it is very questionably handled, while the artistic conception is developed with the most consummate success. Old Paris lives for us with newness of life. We have ever before our eyes the city cut into 3 by the 2 arms of the river, the boat-shaped island moored by 5 bridges to the different shores, and the 2 unequal towns on either hand. We forget all that enumeration of palaces and churches and convents which occupy so many pages of admirable description, and the thoughtless reader might be inclined to conclude from this that they were pages thrown away. But this is not so. We forget indeed the details, as we forget or do not see the different layers of paint on a completed picture. But the thing desired has been accomplished, and we carry away with us a sense of the Gothic profile of the city, of the surprising forest of pinnacles and towers and belfries, and we know not what of rich and intricate and quaint. And throughout Notre Dame has been held up over Paris by a height far greater than that of its twin towers. The cathedral is present to us from the first page to the last. The title has given us the clue, and already in the Palace of Justice the story begins to attach itself to that central building by character after character. It is purely an effect of mirage. Notre Dame does not, in reality, thus dominate and stand out above the city, and anyone who should visit it in the spirit of Scott tourists to Edinburgh or the Trossachs would be almost offended at finding nothing more than this old church thrust away into a corner. It is purely an effect of mirage, as we say, but it is an effect that permeates and possesses the whole book with astonishing consistency and strength. And then Hugo has peopled this Gothic city, and above all this Gothic church, with a race of men even more distinctly Gothic than their surroundings. We know this generation already. We have seen them clustered about the worn capitals of pillars, or craning forth over the church leads with the open mouths of gargoyles. About them all there is that sort of stiff, quaint unreality, that conjunction of the grotesque, and even of a certain bourgeois snugness. I wonder if it's meant to be snugness or smugness, but we've got snugness here, as in, cozy and snug, snugness, with passionate contortion, with horror that is so characteristic of Gothic art. Esmeralda is somewhat an exception. She and the goat traverse the story like 2 children who have wandered in a dream. The finest moment of the book is when the 2 share, with the 2 other leading characters, Dom Claude and Quasimodo, the chill shelter of the old cathedral. It is here that we touch most intimately the generative artistic idea of the romance. Are they not all 4 taken out of some quaint moulding illustrative of the Beatitudes or the 10 Commandments or the 7 deadly sins? What is Quasimodo but an animated gargoyle? What is the whole book but the reanimation of Gothic art? It is curious that in this, the earliest of the 5 great romances, that there should be so little of that extravagance that latterly we have come almost to identify with the author's manner. Yet even here we are distressed by words, thoughts, and incidents that defy belief and alienate the sympathies. The scene of the inn pace, for example, in spite of its strength, verges dangerously on the province of the penny novel. I do not believe that Quasimodo rode upon the bell. I should as soon imagine that he swung by the clapper. And again, the following 2 sentences out of an otherwise admirable chapter surely surpass what it has ever entered into the heart of any other man to imagine. Volume 2, page 180. And we have some lines in French here. One other fault before we pass on. In spite of the horror and misery that pervade all of his later work, there is in it much less of actual melodrama than here, and rarely, I should say never, that sort of brutality, that useless, insufferable violence to the feeling, which is the last distinction between melodrama and true tragedy. Now in Notre Dame, this whole story of Esmeralda's passion for the worthless archer is unpleasant enough, but when she betrays herself in her lost hiding place, herself and her wretched mother, by calling out to this sordid hero, who has long since forgotten her, well, that is just one of those things that readers will not forgive. They do not like it, and they are quite right. Life is hard enough for poor mortals without having it indefinitely embittered for them by bad art. We look in vain for any similar blemish in Les Miserables. Here, on the other hand, there is perhaps the nearest approach to literary restraint that Hugo has ever made. There is here certainly the ripest and most easy development of his powers. It is the moral intention of this great novel to awaken us a little, if it may be, for such awakenings are unpleasant, to the great cost of this society that we support and enjoy by profit, and profit by, to the labor and the sweat of those who support the litter, civilization in which we ourselves are so soothingly carried forward. People are all glad to shut their eyes, and it gives them a very simple pleasure when they can forget that our laws commit a million individual injustices to be once roughly just in the general. That the bread that we eat and the quiet of the family and all that embellishes life and makes it worth having have to be purchased by death, by the death of animals and the death of men, wearied out with labor, and the deaths of those criminals called tyrants and revolutionaries, and the deaths of those revolutionaries called criminals. It is to something of all this that Victor Hugo wishes to open men's eyes in Les Miserables, and this moral lesson is worked out in masterly coincidence with the artistic effect. The deadly weight of civilization to those who are below presses sensibly on our shoulders as we read. A sort of mocking indignation grows upon us as we find society rejecting again and again the services of the most serviceable, setting Jean Valjean to pick oakum, casting Galileo into prison, even crucifying Christ. There is a haunting and horrible sense of insecurity about the book. The terror we thus feel is a terror for the machinery of law, that we can hear tearing in the dark, good and bad between its formidable wheels, from the iron stolidity of all machinery, human or divine. This terror incarnates itself sometimes and leaps horribly out upon us, as when the crouching mendicant looks up and Jean, in the light of the street lamp, recognizes the face of the detective, as when the lantern of the patrol flashes suddenly through the darkness of the sewer, or as when the fugitive comes forth at last at evening by the quiet riverside and finds the police there also, waiting stolidly for the vice and stolidly satisfied to take virtue instead. The whole book is full of oppression and full of prejudice, which is the great cause of oppression. We have the prejudices of M. Gillenormand, the prejudice of Marius, the prejudices in revolt that defend the barricade, and the throned prejudices that carry it by storm. And then we have the admirable but ill-written character of Javert, the man who had made a religion of the police, and would not survive the moment when he learned that there was another truth outside the truth of laws, a just creation over which the reader will do well to ponder. With so gloomy a design, this great work is still full of light, life, and love. The portrait of the good bishop is one of the most agreeable things in modern literature. The whole scene of Montfermeil is full of the charm that Hugo knows so well how to throw about children. Who can forget the passage where Cosette, sent out at night to draw water, stands in admiration before the illuminated booth, and the husker behind And we have another sentence in French here. The pathos of the forlorn Sabbat, laid trustingly by the chimney in expectation of the Santa Claus that was not, takes us fairly by the throat. There is nothing in Shakespeare that touches the heart more nearly. The loves of Cosette and Marius are very pure and pleasant, and we cannot refuse our affection to Gavroche, although we may make a mental reservation of a profound disbelief in his existence. Take it for all in all, there are few books in the world that can be compared with it. There is as much calm and serenity as Hugo has ever attained to. The melodramatic coarseness that disfigured Notre Dame are no longer present. There is certainly much that is painfully improbable, and again the story itself is a little too well constructed. It produces on us the effect of a puzzle, and we grow incredulous as we find that every character fits again and again into the plot, and is, like the child's cube, serviceable on 6 faces. Things are not so well arranged in life as all that comes to. Some of the digressions also seem out of place, and do nothing but interrupt and irritate, but when all is said, the book remains of masterly conception and of masterly development, full of pathos, full of truth, full of high eloquence. And reaching back down for a beer. And this is quite a long chapter here. So if you're still holding in here at 31 minutes, I hope you're enjoying. Let me just do a quick little flip through. I think we're just past the halfway point. We have 10 pages left here. A few sips of the beer to keep me going. I do love to read aloud here, but sometimes with these longer chapters, I do wonder if I ought to split them up, but I would almost rather keep them in one bit because they are, a single chapter, a single essay, a single work. Superstition and social exigency having been thus dealt with in the first 2 members of the series, it remained for Les Travailleurs de la Mer to show man hand to hand with the elements, the last form of external force that is brought against him. And here once more the artistic effect and the moral lesson are worked out together, and are indeed one. Gilliatt, alone upon the reef of his Herculean task, offers a type of human industry in the midst of the vague diffusion of forces into the limitable, and the visionary development of wasted labor in the sea and the winds and the clouds. No character was ever thrown into such strange relief as Gilliatt. The great circle of seabirds that comes wonderingly about him on the night of his arrival strikes at once the note of his preeminence in isolation. He fills the whole reef with his indefatigable toil. This solitary spot in the ocean rings with the clamor of his anvil. We see him as he comes and goes, thrown out sharply against the clear background of the sea. And yet his isolation is not to be compared with the isolation of Robinson Crusoe, for example. Indeed, no 2 books could be more instructive to set side by side than Les Travailleurs and this other of the old days before art had learned to occupy itself with what lies outside of human will. Crusoe was one sole center of interest in the midst of a nature utterly dead and utterly unrealized by the artist. But this is not how we feel with Gilliatt. We feel that he was opposed by a dark coalition of forces, that an immense animosity surrounds him. We are the witnesses of the terrible warfare that he wages with the silent inclemency of phenomena going their own way, and the great general law implacable and passive. A conspiracy of the indifferency of things is against him. There is not one interest on the reef, but 2. Just as we recognize Gilliatt for the hero, we recognize, as implied by this indifferency of things, this direction of forces to some purpose outside our purposes, yet another character who may almost take rank as the villain of the novel, and the 2 face up to one another, blow for blow, feint for feint, until in the storm they fight it especially out. And Gilliatt remains the victor, a victor, however, who is still to encounter the octopus. I need say nothing of the gruesome, repulsive excellence of that famous scene. It will be enough to remind the reader that Gilliatt is in pursuit of a crab when he is himself assaulted by the devilfish, and that this is, in its way, is the last touch to the inner significance of the book. Here indeed is the true position of man in the universe. But in Les Travailleurs, with all its strength, with all its eloquence, with all the beauty and fitness of its main situations, we cannot conceal from ourselves that there is a thread of something that will not bear calm scrutiny. There is much that is disquieting about the storm, admirably as it begins. I am very doubtful whether it would be possible to keep the boat from foundering in such circumstances by any amount of breakwater and broken rock. I do not understand the way in which the waves are spoken of, and prefer just to look at it as a loose way of speaking and pass on. And lastly, how does it happen that the sea was quite calm next day? Is this great hurricane a piece of scene painting after all? And that when we have forgiven Gilliatt's prodigies of strength, although in soberness he reminds us more of Porthos in the Viscount de Bragelonne than is quite desirable. What is to be said to his suicide, and how are we to condemn in adequate terms that unprincipled avidity after effect which tells us that the sloop disappeared after the horizon and the head under the water at one and the same moment? Mr. Hugo may say what he will, but we know better. We know very well that they did not. And a thing like that raises up a despairing spirit of oppression in a man's readers. They give him the lie fiercely as they read. Lastly, we have here already some beginning of that curious series of English blunders that makes us wonder if there are neither proof sheets nor judicious friends in the whole of France, and affects us sometimes with a sickening uneasiness as to what may be our own exploits when we touch upon foreign countries and foreign tongues. It is here that we shall find the famous first of the fourth, and many English words that may be comprehensible perhaps in Paris. It is here that we learn that Laird in Scotland is the same title as Lord in England. Here also is an account of a Highland soldier's equipment, which we recommend to the lovers of genuine fun. In L'Homme qui rit, it was Hugo's object to denounce, as he would say himself, the aristocratic principle as it was exhibited in England, and this purpose, somewhat more unmitigatedly satiric than that of the last two, must answer for much that is unpleasant in the book. The repulsiveness of the scheme of the story, and the manner in which it is bound up with impossibilities and absurdities, discourage the reader at the outset, and it needs an effort to take it as seriously as it deserves. And yet, when we judge it deliberately, it will be seen that here again, the story is admirably adapted to the moral. The constructive ingenuity exhibited throughout is almost morbid. Nothing could be more happily imagined as a reducto ad absurdum of the aristocratic principle than the adventures of Gwynplaine, the itinerant mountebank, snatched suddenly out of his little way of life and installed without preparation as one of the hereditary legislators of a great country. It is with a very bitter irony that the paper on which all this depends is left afloat for years at the will of wind and tide. What again can be finer in conception than that voice from the people heard suddenly in the House of Lords, in solemn arraignment of the pleasures and privileges of its splendid occupants? The horrible laughter stamped forever by the order of the king upon the face of this strange spokesman of democracy adds yet another feature of justice to the scene. In all time, travesty has been the argument of oppression, and in all time the oppressed might have made this answer: if I am vile, is it not your system that has made me so? This ghastly laughter gives occasion, moreover, for the one strain of tenderness running through the web of this unpleasant story, the love of the blind girl D for the monster. It is a most benignant providence that thus harmoniously brings together these two misfortunes. It is one of those compensations, one of those afterthoughts of a relenting destiny that reconcile from us from time to time to the evil that is in this world. The atmosphere of the book is purified by the presence of this pathetic love. It seems to be above the story somehow, and not of it, as the full moon over the night of some foul and feverish city. There is here a quality in the narration more intimate and particular than is general with Hugo. But it must be owned, on the other hand, that the book is wordy and even, now and then, a little wearisome. Eurus and his wolf are pleasant enough companions, but the former is nearly as much an abstract type as the latter. There is a beginning also of an abuse of conventional conversation, such as may be quite pardonable in the drama where needs must, but is without excuse in the romance. Lastly, I suppose one must say a word or two about the weak points of this immaculate novel. If so, it would be best to distinguish at once the large family of English blunders, to which we have alluded already in speaking of Les Travailleurs, are of a sort that is really indifferent in art. If Shakespeare makes his ship cast anchor by some seaport of Bohemia, if Hugo imagines Tom Tick Jack to be a likely nickname for an English sailor, or if either Shakespeare or Hugo, or Scott for that matter, be guilty of figments enough to confuse the march of a whole history, anachronisms enough to overset all chronology, the life of their creatures, the artistic truth and the accuracy of their works is not so much as compromised. But when we come upon a passage like the sinking of the Oroque in this romance, we can do nothing but cover our face with our hands. The conscientious reader feels a sort of disgrace in the very reading. For such artistic falsehoods, springing from what I have called already an unprincipled avidity after effect, no amount of blame can be exaggerated. And above all, when the criminal is such a man as Victor Hugo, we cannot forgive in him what we might have passed over in a third-rate sensation novelist. Little as he seems to know of the sea and nautical affairs, he must have known very well that vessels do not go down as he makes the Oroque go down. He must have known that such a liberty with fact was against the laws of the game, and incompatible with all appearance of sincerity in conception or workmanship. In each of these books, one after another, there has been some departure from the traditional canons of romance. But taking each separately, one would have feared to make too much of these departures, or to found any theory upon what was perhaps purely accidental. The appearance of 423 has put us out of the region of such doubt, like a doctor who has long been hesitating how to classify an epidemic malady. We have come at last upon a case so well remarked that our uncertainty is at an end. It is a novel built upon a sort of enigma, which was at that date laid before revolutionary France, and which is presented by Hugo to Telmarsh, to Lentenac, to Gavin, and very terribly to Simordian, each of whom gives his own solution of the question, clement or stern, according to the temper of his spirit. That enigma was this: can a good action be a bad action? Does not he who spares the wolf kill the sheep? This question, as I say, meets with one answer after another during the course of the book, and yet seems to remain undecided to the end. And something in the same way, although one character or one set of characters after another comes to the front and occupies our attention for the moment. We never identify our interest with any of these temporary heroes, nor regret them after they are withdrawn. We soon come to regard them somewhat as special cases of a general law. What we really care for is something that they only imply and body forth to us. We know how history continues through century after century, how this king or that patriot disappears from its pages with his whole generation, and yet we do not cease to read, nor do we even feel as if we had reached any legitimate conclusion, because our interest is not in the men, but in the country that they loved or hated, benefited or injured. And so it is here. Gavin and Simordian pass away, and we regard them no more than the lost armies of which we find the cold statistics in military annals. What we regard is what remains behind. It is the principle that put these men where they were, that filled them for a while with heroic inspiration, and has the power, now that they are fallen, to inspire others with the same courage. The interest of the novel centers about revolutionary France. Just as the plot is an abstract judicial difficulty, the hero is an abstract historical force. And this has been done not, as it would have been before, by the cold and cumbersome machinery of allegory, but with bold, straightforward realism, dealing only with the objective materials of art, and dealing with them so masterfully that the palest abstractions of thought come before us and move our hopes and fears as if they were the young maidens and men of customary romance. The episode of the mother and children in 423 is equal to anything that Hugo has ever written. There is one chapter in the second volume, for instance, that is full of the very stuff of true tragedy, and nothing could be more delightful than the humors of the three children on the day before the assault. The passage on La Vendée is really great, and the scenes in Paris have much of the same broad merit. The book is full, as usual, of pregnant and splendid sayings. But when thus much is conceded by way of praise, we come to the other scale of the balance, and find this also somewhat heavy. This is here a yet greater overemployment of conventional dialogue than in L'Homme qui rit, and much of that should have been said by the author himself, if it were to be said at all. He has most unwarrantedly put into the mouths of one or other of his characters. We should like to know what becomes of the main body of the troop in the wood of La Saudre during the 30 pages or so in which the four guards lay aside all discipline and stops to gossip over a woman and some children. We have an unpleasant idea forced upon us at one place, in spite of all the good-natured incredulity that we can summon up to resist it. It is possible that Hugo thinks they ceased to steer the corvette. Is it possible that Hugo thinks they ceased to steer the corvette while the gun was loose? Of the chapter in which Lantenac and Halmaro are alone together in the boat, the less said the better. Of course, if there were nothing else, they would have been swamped 3 times over the course of Lantenac's harangue. Again, after Lantenac has landed, we have scenes of almost intimidable workmanship that suggest the epithet statuesque by their clear and trenchant outline. But the tocsin scene will not do, and the tocsin unfortunately pervades the whole passage, ringing continually in our ears with a taunting accusation of falsehood. And then, when we are come to the place where Lantenac meets the royalists, under the idea that he is going to meet the Republicans, it seems as if there were a hitch in the stage mechanism. I have tried it over in every way, and I cannot conceive any disposition that would make the scene possible as narrated. Such then, with their faults and their signal excellences, are the 5 great novels. Romance is a language in which many persons learn to speak, with a certain appearance of fluency. But there are few who can ever bend it in any practical need, few who can ever be said to express themselves in it. It has become abundantly plain in the foregoing examination that Hugo occupies a high place among those few. He has always a perfect command over his stories, and we see that they are constructed with a high regard to some ulterior purpose, and that every situation is informed with moral significance and grandeur. Of no other man can the same thing be said in the same degree. His romances are not to be confused with a novel with a purpose, as familiar to the English reader. This is generally the model of incompetence, and we see the moral clumsily forced into every hole and corner of the story, or thrown externally over it, like a carpet over a railing. Now the moral significance with Hugo is of the essence of the romance. It is the organizing principle. If you could somehow despoil Les Miserables or Les Travailleurs of their distinctive lessons, you would find that the story had lost its interest and the book was dead. Having thus learned to subordinate his story to an idea, to make his art speak, he went on to teach it to say things heretofore unaccustomed. If you look back at the 5 books of which we have now so hastily spoken, you will be astonished at the freedom with which the original purposes of storytelling have been laid aside and passed by. Where are now the 2 lovers who descended the main watershed of all the Waverley novels, and all the novels that have tried to follow in their wake? Sometimes they are almost lost of sight before the solemn isolation of a man against the sea and sky, as in Les Travailleurs. Sometimes, as in Les Miserables, they merely figure for a while as a beautiful episode in the epic oppression. Sometimes they are entirely absent, as in 93. There is no hero in Notre Dame. In Les Mis, it is an old man. In L'Homme qui rit, it is a monster. In 93, it is the revolution. Those elements that only begin to show themselves timidly as adjuncts in the novels of Walter Scott have usurped ever more and more of the canvas, until we find the whole interest of one of Hugo's romances centering around matter that Fielding would have banished from his altogether, as being out of the field of fiction. So we have elemental forces occupying nearly as large a place, playing, so to speak, nearly as important a role as the main Gilliatt, who opposes and overcomes them. So we find the fortunes of a nation put upon the stage with as much vividness as ever before the fortunes of a village maiden or of a lost heir, and the forces that oppose and corrupt a principle holding the attention quite as strongly as the wicked barons or dishonest attorneys of the past. Hence, Those individual interests that were supreme in Fielding and even in Scott stood out over everything else and formed, as it were, the spine of the story. Figure here only as one set of interests among many sets, one force among many forces, and one thing to be treated out of the whole world of things equally vivid and important. So that for Hugo, man is no longer an isolated spirit without antecedent or relation here below, but a being involved in the action and reaction of natural forces, himself a center of such action and reaction, or a unit in great multitude, chased hither and thither by epidemic terrors and aspirations, and in all seriousness blown about by every wind of doctrine. This is a long way that we have traveled. Between such work and the work of Fielding, is there not indeed a great gulf in thought and sentiment? Art thus conceived realizes for men a larger portion of life, and that portion, one that is a more difficult for them to realize unaided, and besides helping them to feel more intensely those restricted personal interests which are patent to all, it awakens in them some consciousness of those more general relations that are so strangely invisible to the average man in ordinary moods. It helps to keep man in his place in nature, and above all, it helps him to understand more intelligently the responsibilities of his place in society. And in all this generalization of interest, we never miss those small humanities that are at the top, opposite pole of excellence in art. And while we admire the intellect that could see life thus largely, we are touched with another sentiment for the tender heart that slipped the piece of gold into Cosette's sabot, that was virginally troubled at the fluttering of her dress in the spring wind, or put the blind girl beside the deformity of the laughing man. This, then, is the last praise that we can award to these romances. The author has shown a power of just subordination hitherto unequaled, and as, in reaching forward to one class of effects, he has not been forgetful or careless of the other. His work is more nearly complete work, and his art, with all its imperfections, deals more comprehensively with the materials of life than that of any of his otherwise more sure and masterly predecessors. These 5 books would have made a very great fame for any writer, and yet they are but one facade of the monument that is Hugo, and that Hugo has erected to his genius. Everywhere we find somewhat the same greatness, somewhat the same infirmities. In his poems and plays, there are the same unaccountable prodigies that have already astonished us in romances. There, too, is the same feverish strength, welding the fiery iron of his idea under forge hammer repetitions, an emphasis that is somehow akin to weakness, a strength that is a little epileptic. He stands so far above all his contemporaries, and so incomparably excels them in richness, breadth, and variety, and moral earnestness, that we almost feel as if he had a sort of right to fall oftener and more heavily than others. But this does not reconcile us to seeing him profit by the privilege so freely. We like to have in our great men something that is above question. We like to place an implicit faith in them and see them always on the platform of their greatness. And this, unhappily, cannot be with Hugo. As Heine said long ago, his is a genius somewhat deformed, but deformed as it is, we accept it gladly. We shall have the wisdom to see where his foot slips, but we shall have the justice also to recognize in him one of the greatest artists of our generation, and in many ways one of the greatest artists of all time. If we look back yet once upon these 5 romances, we see blemishes such as we can lay to the charge of no other man in the number of the famous. But to what other man can we attribute such sweeping innovations, such a new and significant presentment of the life of man, such an amount, if we merely think of the amount of equally consummate performance? And that is the end of the chapter here. And as we've seen, Stevenson is quite critical, somewhat severe at times, of what he sees as Hugo's deficiencies in perhaps the unreality of some of his scenes, the unrealness of certain actions, and also in unnecessarily dialogue, unnecessarily added scenes in some of the books. But we can also tell that Stevenson also loved the works of Hugo very much as well. And so that brings us to the end there, and I will slip this very delicate bookmark back in here. And the next chapter here is titled Some Aspects of Robert Burns.